In 1962, a man sold millions of American children a lie, and the children loved him for it. Here's the number that stops people cold. Over the next 6 decades, more than 1 billion units of this product were sold worldwide. 1 billion. That's more than one for every person alive in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia combined. The product generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue across its lifetime, and at its peak in the 1970s, it was pulling in what would be equivalent to over $50 million a year in today's money from comic book ads alone. And the entire empire was built on brine shrimp, tiny microscopic crustaceans that looked nothing, absolutely nothing, like the smiling human-faced aquatic family's children were promised. His name was Harold von Braunhut. He wasn't a scientist, he wasn't a marine biologist, he was a carnival promoter turned mail-order genius who understood one thing better than almost anyone in American business history. Children don't buy products. Children buy dreams. And if you can illustrate a dream vividly enough, print it in the back of a comic book, and sell it for less than $1, you can build an empire. But here's what no one's talking about. The sea monkey story isn't just about a clever novelty toy. It's about the infrastructure of childhood deception that was legally permitted, widely celebrated, and entirely deliberate. It's about a marketing machine so sophisticated that it still influences how products are sold to children today. And it's about a man whose private life was so contradictory, so jaw-dropping, that when the truth finally came out, it shattered everything people thought they knew about the wholesome little creatures they'd raised on their bedroom windowsills. The real story of sea monkeys involves neo-Nazi connections, federal investigations, patent battles, a dying woman who spent her final years fighting to save the empire she built, and a marketing fraud so elegant it was technically legal. If you're ready to see what really happened, let's begin. Let's start with Harold von Braunhut. Because to understand sea monkeys, you have to understand the man who invented them. Harold Nathan Braunhut was born in 1926 in New York City. He was not the sophisticated European nobleman his adopted name implied. The von was invented, a piece of personal theater that told you everything about how Harold operated. If the product didn't sound impressive enough, you rebranded it. If your name wasn't exotic enough, you changed it. Harold understood instinctively that perception was everything, and reality was negotiable. By the 1940s and early 1950s, Harold had bounced between careers. He promoted boxing matches, he sold novelty items, he worked the edges of the entertainment world, always looking for that one concept, that one product that could scale. He had a gift for identifying things that seemed magical to children and a complete lack of sentimentality about whether the magic was real or manufactured. In the mid-1950s, Harold encountered a marine biologist named Anthony D'Agostino, and through him, a creature called Artemia salina, brine shrimp. These were tiny crustaceans that lived in salt lakes, places like the Great Salt Lake in Utah and the salted lagoons of coastal Europe. What made them extraordinary wasn't what they looked like. It was what they could do. Brine shrimp had evolved a survival mechanism almost unprecedented in the animal kingdom. When their environment dried up, when the salt lake evaporated in the summer heat, the shrimp didn't die. They entered a state called cryptobiosis. Their eggs essentially turned themselves off. They became desiccated, dormant, suspended between life and death, capable of surviving for years, some studies suggest decades, in completely dry conditions. Then, when water returned, the eggs hatched. Life resumed, as if no time had passed at all. Harold von Braunhut looked at this biological miracle and saw something else entirely. He saw a mail-order product. Here's where the genius began, and the manipulation. Harold partnered with a scientist named Dr. Edwin Seal to develop the commercial packaging. The idea was brutally simple. Dry the brine shrimp eggs, package them in small envelopes, add some chemicals to condition the water, and sell the whole kit through the mail. Children would add water, and within 24 to 48 hours, living creatures would appear. Life, literally, from a packet of powder. The first version of the product launched in 1957 under the name Instant Life. It sold reasonably well. But Harold knew it wasn't there yet. The name was too clinical, too scientific. It didn't capture the wonder he needed to sell at scale. He needed a name that turned a crustacean into a character. He needed a name that made a child look at a tank of barely visible specks and imagine a civilization. In 1962, Harold renamed the product sea monkeys. Why sea monkeys? Because the creatures had feathery tails that, if you squinted hard enough and wanted badly enough to see it, vaguely resembled a monkey's tail when viewed under a microscope. That was it. That was the entire scientific basis for the name. And it was perfect. Because sea monkey didn't describe a crustacean. It described a pet, a companion, something with personality and intelligence and maybe, just maybe, a family living in a tiny underwater castle. But here's the real problem. Harold didn't just rename the product. He reinvented what it was supposed to be, and that reinvention required an artist. Enter Joe Orlando and later, most famously, Joe Levering. But the defining visual identity of Sea Monkeys was ultimately shaped through the work commissioned by Harold himself, most recognizably executed by artist Len Lovett. The advertisement showed a family, an actual family. A sea monkey father with a crown on his head, muscular and upright, standing in an underwater kingdom. A sea monkey mother with long, flowing hair, curved and feminine. Sea monkey children playing in the background. They had faces. They had expressions. They were happy. They were smiling directly at the child reading the comic book. This wasn't an accident. Every single element of that illustration was calculated. The crown suggested royalty, that owning sea monkeys was like owning a kingdom of your very own. The family structure appealed to children's desire for nurture and relationship. The underwater city backdrop made the creatures seem civilized, intelligent, organized. These were not animals. These were tiny people. Tiny, magical people who would live in your room and be your friends. The fine print, buried at the bottom of the advertisement in type so small a child could barely read it, said the illustration was a fanciful depiction, a caricature, not representative of actual animals. Technically, legally, Harold had covered himself. But here's the part no one's talking about. The fine print was never the product. The illustration was the product. Harold was selling a picture, not a creature, and millions of children bought it. The advertisements ran primarily in comic books. This was not a coincidence. Harold understood the demographics of comic book readers in the 1960s with a precision that would impress modern data analysts. The core audience was children aged 6 to 14, predominantly boys, from working-class and middle-class families. These were children with access to small amounts of money, birthday money, allowances, small earnings from chores, but without the skeptical consumer education that adults might apply to a purchase. And the price point was perfect. The basic Sea Monkey kit retailed for around $1.25 in 1962. That's approximately $12 to $13 in today's money. Cheap enough that a child could buy it independently. Cheap enough that parents didn't feel the need to scrutinize the purchase too carefully. But the profit margins were extraordinary because brine shrimp eggs cost almost nothing to produce at scale. Now let's look at the distribution machine Harold built, because this is where the scale becomes staggering. By the mid-1960s, Sea Monkey advertisements were appearing in hundreds of different comic book titles: DC Comics, Marvel Comics, Archie Comics, Gold Key Comics, Harvey Comics. If children were reading it, Harold was advertising in it. The advertisements weren't just present, they were dominant. They occupied full-page spaces, half-page spaces, and the legendary back-page real estate that every child's eye went to the moment they finished reading. At the peak of the comic book advertising era in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Harold's company, Tranchance Corporation, was placing advertisements in comics that collectively sold more than 300 million copies per year. 300 million. Even with a conservative conversion rate of 1 purchase per 100 exposures, that's 3 million unit sales per year from comic books alone. And the actual conversion rates were far higher than that. Here's the financial picture. In 1970, a full-page black-and-white advertisement in a major comic book cost approximately $500 to $1,500 to place. A single successful sea monkey ad in a high-circulation comic could generate $15,000 to $40,000 in direct mail orders. The return on advertising investment was extraordinary, sometimes 10 times or more on a single placement. Harold was effectively printing money, but that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was what happened when the children received their order. So how did it happen? Let me show you. A child, let's say it's 1968, let's say he's 9 years old, living in Ohio or Pennsylvania or suburban California, sees the advertisement in his copy of Batman or Amazing Spider-Man. He sees the smiling sea monkey family. He reads the words, "Bowls of Happiness, the amazing world of sea monkeys." He reads about how sea monkeys can be trained, how they can perform tricks, how they recognize their owner. He mails in his $1.25 plus postage, which might represent 3 or 4 weeks of saved allowance. 3 to 6 weeks later, because this was mail order in the 1960s and delivery was measured in weeks, not days, a small package arrives. Inside is a plastic tank shaped like a submarine. Inside the tank are 3 packets, a water purifier, the eggs themselves, and a growth food packet. He reads the instructions carefully. He adds the water. He waits. 24 hours later, tiny specks appear in the water. They're moving. They're alive. He leans in close. He looks for the crown. He looks for the flowing hair. He looks for the underwater castle. There is no crown. There is no castle. There are barely visible transparent shrimp, roughly the size of a comma on this page, swimming in confused circles. Gone. The family was gone. The kingdom was gone. The promise was gone. The psychological impact on children was significant enough to generate academic discussion decades later. Child psychologists studying the sea monkey phenomenon noted that the product created one of the most reliably documented cases of consumer disappointment in toy history. And Harold knew this was happening. He knew from the beginning. The gap between illustration and reality was not an oversight. It was a design feature. Wait a minute, and let me be precise about this. Harold von Braunhut didn't set out to hurt children. He set out to make money. Those are different motivations that can produce similar outcomes. His genius and his fault was that he understood the gap between expectation and reality so well that he built a business model around managing that gap rather than closing it. Here's the kicker. Sea monkeys were not fake. That's the part of this story that makes it genuinely fascinating rather than simply shameful. Brine shrimp are real animals with a genuinely remarkable biology. The cryptobiosis phenomenon, that ability to essentially pause life and resume it, is one of the most extraordinary survival adaptations in the animal kingdom. Scientists in the 1950s and 1960s were genuinely excited about brine shrimp for this reason. The NASA space program conducted experiments with brine shrimp eggs, testing whether organisms in cryptobiosis could survive the vacuum and radiation of space. The answer was yes. Brine shrimp eggs are among the most radiation-resistant biological structures ever studied. Adult brine shrimp do have some responsiveness to external stimuli. They swim toward light. They move away from disturbances. Whether this constitutes trainability in any meaningful sense is debatable, but Harold's advertisements were careful enough in their language, can be trained to perform tricks rather than will perform tricks, to maintain a thin layer of technical defensibility. The growth food worked, the water conditioner worked, the hatching process worked with impressive reliability. Children who followed the instructions correctly did in fact get living creatures. This was genuinely innovative product design for the late 1950s, and Harold deserved credit for engineering a stable, repeatable consumer experience around a biological product that could easily have been unreliable. But here's the real problem. The product that Harold delivered was a science experiment. The product he sold was a pet. He delivered Artemia Selena. He sold a kingdom with smiling subjects, and the distance between those two things was a chasm wide enough to swallow the childhood dreams of millions. Now we're 2/3 of the way through this story, and it's time to talk about the facts that somehow never make it into the cheerful, nostalgic coverage of sea monkeys. The articles that call Harold von Braunhut a quirky inventor and a marketing genius. The retrospectives that focus on the whimsy and skip the weight. Here are the things nobody's talking about. Reason 1. Harold von Braunhut had documented ties to white supremacist organizations that have been almost entirely absent from mainstream coverage of his business legacy. According to reporting by journalist Gregory Ross in a 1988 article and subsequent research published in the 1990s, Harold attended and financially supported gatherings of the Aryan Nations, one of the most prominent neo-Nazi organizations in America at the time. He reportedly donated at least $12,500 to the Aryan Nations and KKK-affiliated groups during the 1980s and 1990s. Harold von Braunhut, the man whose product had been sold primarily through comic books aimed at children from all backgrounds, many of them non-white, was financially supporting organizations that promoted white supremacy. This was not a rumor. This was documented, and it has been largely absent from the sea monkey nostalgia industry. Reason 2. The advertising claims for sea monkeys would almost certainly violate modern Federal Trade Commission guidelines for children's advertising. The FTC substantially strengthened its rules on advertising to children between the 1970s and 1990s, specifically in response to cases where illustrations materially misrepresented what a product looked like and how it functioned. The sea monkey advertisements, showing humanoid creatures in castles, claiming they could be trained, implying intelligence and social behavior, were operating in a regulatory environment that had not yet caught up with the sophistication of Harold's marketing. The fanciful depiction fine print was a legal fig leaf, not a genuine disclosure. A child cannot meaningfully consent to a purchase when the visual representation of the product bears no relationship to the actual product. Reason 3. Harold was selling multiple products through the same comic book channels, and the Sea Monkey blueprint, illustrate a fantasy, bury the disclaimers, profit from the gap between expectation and reality, was applied systematically across his product line. X-ray specs glasses that supposedly let you see through solid objects. Amazing live seahorses that were real animals but marketed with the same inflated promises. Crazy crabs. Grow a frog from a tadpole. Each product followed the same formula. Find something real, illustrate something magical, accept no legal responsibility for the gap. Harold didn't accidentally discover this formula once. He perfected it as a business model and applied it repeatedly across decades. Reason 4. The Sea Monkey success story has been used as a positive business case study, a story about entrepreneurial ingenuity and marketing creativity in ways that systematically omit the consumer harm dimension. Business schools, marketing textbooks, and entrepreneurship workshops have cited Harold's work as an example of brilliant positioning and audience understanding. And in a narrow technical sense, it was. But framing it purely as a triumph of marketing erases the reality of millions of children who saved their allowances, waited weeks for delivery, and experienced genuine disappointment. The financial success of the product does not retroactively make the deception ethical. Reason 5. The woman who actually saved sea monkeys, who made them into the lasting cultural phenomenon they became, has been systematically underplayed in the narrative. Her name was Yolanda Signorelli von Braunhut, and she married Harold in the 1980s. Yolanda was not just a spouse, she was a business partner who transformed sea monkeys from a declining novelty into a licensed property that appeared on Saturday morning cartoons in major retailers and in international markets. When Harold died in 2003, it was Yolanda who fought to preserve the brand and the patents. And when she herself was diagnosed with a terminal illness in her final years, she fought through the courts to ensure that the sea monkey legacy would survive her, a battle that lasted until shortly before her death. The man gets the mythology. The woman who built the modern version of the empire gets a footnote. Reason 6. The sea monkey business was fundamentally built on the economics of mail-order fraud tolerance in the pre-consumer protection era. When children wrote letters complaining that their sea monkeys didn't look like the illustration, Harold's company had form responses ready. The responses acknowledged the complaint, offered minor concessions like replacement packets, and reiterated that the illustration was fanciful. This was the corporate equivalent of a shrug. The complaint volume was large enough that Harold's operation had systematized responses to it. which tells you something important about how the company understood the gap between what was sold and what was delivered. Reason 7. The biological reality of sea monkeys involved a significant environmental context that was never disclosed in the advertising. Brine shrimp eggs were harvested primarily from the Great Salt Lake in Utah, where a commercial harvesting industry had developed around the crustacean's remarkable properties. The sustainability of that harvesting and its impact on the local ecosystem was never part of the sea monkey story. Children were buying a product with an environmental supply chain that, at its peak, was removing millions of pounds of eggs from a sensitive ecological system annually. Nobody talked about this because it didn't sell product. Now let's look at what happened after Harold's death. Because this is where the story gets truly complicated. Harold von Braunhut died on November 28, 2003, at the age of 77. He left behind an estate centered on the sea monkey patents and trademarks, and a widow, Yolanda, who had been his partner in building the brand's late-era resurgence. But Harold's death didn't bring peace to the sea monkey enterprise. It brought war. The core battle was over the patents and licensing rights. Harold had structured his business through a complex web of agreements with manufacturers and distributors, and when he died, several parties believed they had claims to various aspects of the sea monkey intellectual property. The company that had been manufacturing and distributing sea monkey products, Big Time Toys, found itself in a disputed legal position. Yolanda, as Harold's widow and heir, claimed control over the brand. The ensuing legal battles cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and stretched across years. But here's the real problem. Yolanda was fighting for the sea monkey legacy while dealing with declining health. She had dedicated the second half of her life to a product whose founder, her husband, turned out to have harbored beliefs and associations that directly contradicted everything the product's wholesome public image represented. And she kept fighting anyway. Because sea monkeys, whatever Harold's private ideology, had genuinely brought wonder to millions of children. Yolanda believed that, she held on to that, and she fought for it until she couldn't fight anymore. The Sea Monkey Saturday morning cartoon, which aired in 1992, was largely Yolanda's achievement. She had recognized that the brand's visual identity, those smiling humanoid characters, had more life in animated form than in any physical product. The cartoon gave the illustrated sea monkey family an actual narrative, actual personalities, actual adventures. It was, in a profound irony, the completion of Harold's original marketing vision. The creatures that could never actually look like their advertisements now looked exactly like their advertisements because they had been fully translated into the medium where the lie had always been most comfortable: pure illustration. Let's talk about money, real money, the kind of numbers that tell you the true size of what Harold built. Between 1962 and Harold's death in 2003, a span of 41 years, sea monkeys generated cumulative revenues that historians of novelty marketing estimate at somewhere between $250 million and $500 million in historical dollars. Converting the mid-range of that estimate, $375 million, to today's purchasing power gives you approximately $1.5 to $2 billion in 2024 dollars. From brine shrimp eggs, the manufacturing cost of a sea monkey kit in the 1970s was approximately 8 to 15 cents per unit. The retail price was $1.25 to $2.50, depending on the kit size and the retailer. That's a markup of 8 times to 15 times on the cost of goods, before Harold's advertising and distribution costs, but those costs were largely fixed once the comic book ads were placed. The marginal cost of selling one more sea monkey kit, once the advertisement was already printed and running, was essentially the cost of the kit itself. Harold's operation at its peak employed fewer than 30 people. 30 people generating what would be equivalent to tens of millions of dollars per year in today's money. The revenue per employee figures were extraordinary by any standard of the era. And here's the comparative picture. In the same years that sea monkeys were generating those returns, major American toy companies, Mattel, Hasbro, Milton Bradley, were operating with thousands of employees, massive manufacturing facilities, enormous capital investment in tooling and inventory, and profit margins that were a fraction of Harold's. The toy industry standard gross margin in the 1970s was approximately 40 to 50%. Harold's gross margins on sea monkeys were north of 80%. He wasn't in the toy business, he was in the imagination business, and imagination has the best margins of any product ever created. This is happening today too. Let me show you exactly where. The sea monkey model didn't die with Harold von Braunhut. It evolved, it scaled, it put on a digital suit and started running social media ads. Consider the mobile gaming industry in the 2000s, games advertised with gameplay footage that bore no resemblance to the actual game. A sophisticated puzzle game shown in advertisements, hiding the reality of a monotonous resource management grind with aggressive in-app purchase requirements. The FTC began investigating this practice in 2019, finding that multiple games had advertised gameplay that was fundamentally different from the actual experience. The settlements cost those companies millions of dollars, but they had already made billions, the Harold formula at internet scale. Consider the fitness supplement industry, where products routinely show illustrated typical results that are legally defined as atypical while selling to customers who don't read disclaimers. The supplement industry in the United States generates approximately $50 billion per year in revenue. Academic studies suggest that 40 to 60% of supplement claims are not supported by credible scientific evidence. The fine print, like Harold's fanciful depiction, provides legal cover. The illustration does the selling. Consider luxury fashion, where the product photographed on a model with professional lighting in an aspirational lifestyle setting bears only a functional relationship to the product that arrives in a box. The price differential between cost and retail in the fashion industry can exceed 10 times. The gap between the dream and the product is the product. And consider, most directly, the modern toy industry's use of glamour shots in advertising that show toys with capabilities and aesthetics they do not possess. The FTC's guidelines on toy advertising specifically prohibit showing a toy doing things it cannot do. Those guidelines exist because Harold's approach became industry standard before regulators caught up. The modern restrictions are the direct legacy of the sea monkey generation. The real reason Harold succeeded wasn't that he was uniquely deceptive, it was that he was uniquely early. He understood the gap between illustration and reality as a commercial tool before consumer protection law understood it as a problem. He built and scaled and profited before the regulatory response could catch him. And everyone who came after him learned from his blueprint. Now let's talk about the children. The actual children who bought sea monkeys. Because here's where the story becomes something more than a business case study. Millions of children experienced the sea monkey disappointment, and then, here's the fascinating part, many of them kept their sea monkeys anyway. They watched the tiny shrimp. They learned that brine shrimp have a lifespan of several months to 2 years in captivity under good conditions. They learned that females can reproduce asexually, without males, under certain conditions. They learned that the shrimp would grow from barely visible specks to approximately half an inch in length. They learned, in other words, actual biology, real science, from a product that had lied to them. The psychological literature on disappointed expectations in childhood sometimes describes a phenomenon called reassessment and accommodation, the process by which a child who expected one thing and received another either rejects the received object or reconstructs their relationship with it by finding genuine value where they'd expected a different kind of value. Sea monkeys were, for many children, an early exercise in exactly this. You expected a kingdom, you got a crustacean, and then you watched the crustacean for a while and found that crustaceans are, in their own right, genuinely interesting. This doesn't exonerate Harold, but it complicates the simple narrative of pure harm. The product was deceptive. The product was also educational. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and the combination produced something culturally durable in a way that purely honest products and purely deceptive products often don't achieve. But here's the part no one's talking about. The children who grew up with sea monkeys became the first generation of American consumers deeply familiar with the gap between advertising and reality. The sea monkey experience was, for millions of children, their first clear lesson that advertisements lie. that the product in the box does not look like the product in the picture, that fine print exists, that the dream you're sold and the thing you receive are different things. And some of those children, the ones who sat with that lesson and really absorbed it, grew up to be skeptical consumers, skeptical voters, skeptical citizens. The sea monkey disappointment was, for some of them, a vaccination against the kinds of illusory promises that follow you throughout life, a kind of inoculation against magical thinking. Was that Harold's intention? Absolutely not. He was selling product. But the effect existed regardless of the intention. Here's where the story lands. And the numbers don't lie. Sea monkeys are still sold today, right now. In 2024, you can walk into a Walmart or a Target or order from Amazon and receive a sea monkey kit. The brand has been continuously active for over 60 years, longer than most major toy brands in American history. Mattel's Barbie was introduced in 1959, the Frisbee in 1957, sea monkeys in 1957 and 1962. Harold's creation has outlasted thousands of toy brands that were backed by far greater resources and far more honest advertising. The brand has been licensed to produce Sea Monkey-branded toys, accessories, novelty items, and the animated television series. It has appeared in popular culture references in films, television shows, and literature. It is an entry in the Oxford English Dictionary. It is taught in marketing courses as a case study, though rarely, as we've discussed, with full honesty about what the case actually teaches. The cumulative number of Sea Monkey kits sold since 1957 exceeds 1 billion units by most industry estimates. 1 billion. At an average revenue of roughly $2 per unit in historical terms, that's $2 billion in historical revenue, converting to somewhere between $5 and $8 billion in today's purchasing power. From brine shrimp eggs and an illustration of a family wearing a crown. Harold von Braunhut, the son of a New York City family who put a von in front of his name and sold children the promise of an underwater kingdom, died worth an estimated $15 to $20 million. That's approximately $25 to $35 million in today's money. Not the robber baron wealth of the Gilded Age families we usually discuss on this channel, but remarkable wealth for a man who started with zero scientific training, zero manufacturing infrastructure, and zero capital. He built it entirely on the most powerful force in American commerce, not technology, not real estate, not finance, imagination, other people's imagination, specifically children's imagination. He found the gap between what children wanted to believe and what existed, and he monetized that gap for 4 decades. So how do we judge Harold von Braunhut? It's not a simple question, and I won't pretend it is. On one hand, he was a genuinely innovative marketer who identified a real biological phenomenon, developed a reliable consumer product around it, and built a distribution system that reached millions of customers with minimal capital. The product worked. The animals were real. The science was sound. Children who kept their sea monkeys did experience something genuine, the observation of a living creature, the cycles of growth and reproduction, the strange wonder of life suspended and resumed. On the other hand, the gap between what was advertised and what was delivered was not an accident. It was engineered. The illustrations were designed to make children believe they were getting something they were not getting. The fanciful depiction disclaimer was a legal device, not a genuine disclosure. The system was constructed to pass the legal minimum while failing the ethical standard. And the documented white supremacist connections of the man who built this system, who built his fortune on selling dreams to children of every background, represent a moral contradiction that the nostalgic sea monkey narrative has been too comfortable ignoring. The real reason Harold's story isn't fully told isn't that it's complicated. The real reason is that the complications are uncomfortable. The whimsy sells. The racism doesn't. The marketing genius is a good story. The exploitation of children's trust is a harder one. And the industry that profits from sea monkey nostalgia, the retrospective articles, the licensing deals, the remember these social media posts, has a financial interest in keeping the story whimsical. Display deceives, reality endures. Harold built a kingdom on the gap between the two. Let me give you the numbers one final time. 1 billion units sold. $5 to $8 billion in purchasing power generated from a creature the size of a grain of rice. 30 employees at peak. 80+% gross margins. 60+ years of continuous market presence. 1 billion children shown an illustration that bore no meaningful relationship to what they would receive. And one man at the center of all of it, a man who put a fake Vaughn in his name, donated to hate groups, and died with $25 million in today's money. The sea monkey story is not fundamentally about brine shrimp. It's about the oldest transaction in commerce, selling someone a version of reality that doesn't exist and charging them for the gap. Harold von Braunhut didn't invent this, but he perfected it for the post-war American childhood, and everyone who came after him, every app with misleading screenshots, every supplement with impossible results ads, every investment scheme promising magical returns, is working from his blueprint. And nobody's talking about this because the story is too convenient to keep simple. The sea monkeys are cute. Harold is a quirky genius. The children were charmed, not harmed. That's the version that moves merchandise, generates clicks, and doesn't require anyone to reckon with what actually happened. The version that requires reckoning is this one.